Welcome to Rising Woman Leaders, a safe space for women to thrive in community where their voices and stories are heard. We're a sisterhood supporting each other to live our dreams and embody the sacred feminine to restore balance on our planet. Join us each week as we return to the unconditional love and guidance of our heart and our womb. I'm your host, Meredith Rom, and I invite you to walk this path of beauty, devotion, and service with us. I'm here today with Morgan Curtis, who is guided by the call to transmute the legacy of her colonizer and enslaver ancestors. Morgan is dedicated to working with her fellow people with wealth and class privilege towards redistribution, atonement, and repair of ancestral harms. As a facilitator, money coach, organizer, and ritualist, she works to catalyze the healing of relationships with self, family, ancestors, community, and the land, enabling the surrender of power and control so that resources can flow towards racial, environmental, and economic justice. She's in the process of redistributing 100% of her inherited wealth and 50% of her income to primarily Black and indigenous-led organizing and land projects. Morgan is a resident of Canticle Farm, a multiracial, interfaith, cross-class, intergenerational, intentional community in Oakland or Lishan Ohlone territory. She is currently a Master's of Divinity student at Harvard Divinity School, focused on racial justice and healing. And you can also learn more about her at her website, morganhcurtis.com. Thanks for being here, Morgan.
Thanks for having me, Meredith. I'm really just glad to get to have this conversation together.
Yeah. So I'm lucky to have been to Canticle Farm and to see this beautiful place where you live. And it's something like these houses on the perimeter, and then on the inside, everyone's taken down their fences, and there's just these beautiful gardens. And I felt really inspired. I think I've only been there once, but really inspired to see what's happening there. Do you want to just start by sharing about that a little bit, your home and what inspired you to live there?
So glad to begin here. And sitting here on Canticle farmland this morning. So feels the right place to begin. And I often say that living here in community is, of all the privileges that I have in my lifetime, the one that's most dear, most important, most impactful for me. And there's 43 of us here living in 8 houses around a central garden, like you described. And we're just doing our very best, trying and failing often and trying again to live out some vision of beloved community, figuring out how to be together in 2021 across so many lines of difference and division. And the thing I most often say that I'm grateful for living here is that I get to touch into some of my most profound hope for what we might be able to do as humans, particularly as Americans on this continent, with our legacy of so much violence. When things are going well here in the community, I feel like I get to taste just that little bit of what our liberation together might feel like. And when things are going badly, I get to really also taste some of my deepest despair of like, if we can't do this with 40 people, how are we ever going to do it with 300 million or so? But living life oscillating between profound hope and deep despair has been pretty life-giving for me.
Yeah, very engaging.
Exactly.
One of the things I loved was just seeing little kids running around, just feeling like, if only, that's how so many people want to raise kids, like with aunties and uncles and people around that can check in on them and, they can play together, and it doesn't have to be that nuclear family unit of isolation, which I think a lot of young moms go through in our culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Just this morning, I had a little 1.5-year-old who was born here in the community during the pandemic, was running around our living room and then ended up on the floor with a stack of goddess cards, going through them one at a time while the adults talked about all sorts of things around him. So just one little moment with the little ones is enough to make my day, for sure.
Yeah. And perhaps you can start with just telling me a little bit about your upbringing and just your family background, and then we can get into how you decided you wanted to be giving so much money to these different organizations. But I'd love to hear a little bit of how you grew up.
So I was born and raised in England, technically on my ancestral lands, though always being reminded that I was American. My parents were expats living in London. They both worked careers in business of different forms. And I was raised in a family with a lot of material privilege and comfort. I never went hungry. I had everything I needed for school and to be comfortable and to learn and have fun. And I got to vacation and visit family and a lot of the things that make up a beautiful, nourishing childhood. And I was also raised with stories of my ancestors and who our people were. It was a family where we had paintings of ancestors on the wall and family silver that came out for special occasions. So this sense of, we've been doing this being comfortable thing for a long time. And even as a little kid, I had this sense of we are different from other families, or we have more than other people do. And this sense of like, the world isn't fair. I have a lot of Libra in my chart, and I think that I was just always talking about fairness as a child. My 9-year-old self was like hiding light bulbs when my brothers left their lights on as like a form of punishment. I was like, we're connected to oil spills and deforestation and the world burning up and ecologies being disrupted was also always really close in for me as a child. A lot of comfort, and at the same time, this sense of things aren't quite right here.
Were those concepts introduced to you by your family, or was it mostly in school or through other people that you were learning about some of those injustices or environmental problems and challenges?
Hard for me to remember. Definitely my dad cares for the earth, and that's part of who he is loving being outside and gardening, being with plants in the more than human world in that way. And my mom worked a lot of her career in education and thinking about access to education. So I see some of the roots of the things I was thinking about in the choices they were making in their own lives and careers. And I think I was pretty quickly challenging them and pushing us into topics that were newer for my family, which I think somewhat came from school and somewhat came from my own reading. I was like that young person who just was reading all the time.
And at some point, from what I know of this story, you had a car that you were going to sell, and you made some money from this car, and you came upon a surprise. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit from there, the story of just how you found out that you had money to your name and your reaction to that.
Yeah, so when I was in college, I came to the US for college, and as my little enviro kid self was like, I'm going to get a biodiesel car. And so I had this old Volkswagen that ran on biodiesel. And one day I put like rotten biodiesel into it and destroyed the engine. Totally my fault. And I sold it basically for scrap. And I think I got $1,600. And I said to my dad, oh, you originally bought this car. Should I write you a check? Where should I send this money? And he said, you can keep it as long as you invest it in the stock market. And at that time, I was organizing for fossil fuel divestment at the college I was attending. And so I was learning very much about the not just complicity, but kind of foundational nature of the economic system and the stock market in particular to a lot of the environmental and social injustices that I'd learned about. And so this idea of investing in the stock market was pretty distasteful for me, but I was like, okay, sure, I'll like invest in some solar panel companies. And so I opened an investment account to go buy my $1,600 of solar panel companies. And the day that I logged into it, there was $350,000 in the account. And I was shocked and confused. I probably hit refresh, being like, is this really my account? I'm going to log out and log back in again. And then called my dad, who said, oh no, you weren't supposed to know about that. This was money that he had invested in my name starting when I was 2 years old. And I think its intention was to pay for me to go to college. And what had made that possible was investments in so many of the same corporations that I was campaigning against at the time. So there I could see Chevron, Exxon, all these same corporate actors whose crimes against humanity and against the earth were motivating me to take action in so many other parts of my life. So that was a huge turning point for me in being like, oh, if these are the issues I care about, I have to start with myself and my own family.
Was that an easy choice, or did that feel confronting of like, oh my God, like, was there shame? What were some of the emotions?
Shock, shame, embarrassment, confusion, and anger also. Just like a kind of feeling of lack of control. Like, this is being done in my name, but I haven't even had a choice to do this.
Mm. And so what happened from there?
And in kind of the language of organizing that I was learning at the time. You could say that I started a campaign whose target was my dad, and it was a one-woman campaign, me. My goal was to divest that account from the stock market, and my strategy is pretty much exclusively focused on being really mad and asking for what I wanted. And that didn't go well for quite a while. I think that I wasn't focused on, what is going to motivate my father to join me in this point of view as much as I was focused on proving him wrong or showing that he'd made a terrible choice by doing this. So that was a long journey, and in many ways it's ongoing, but we worked together to figure out how to divest that account from the oil and gas industry a few years after that, and ultimately through to today, divested from the stock market entirely. So it's been quite the journey with my dad, with some powerful moments of closeness and connection and being on the same page. He chose to divest his own investment accounts from the oil and gas industry around that same time. He really came to see, where we put our money does matter and does need to reflect the values that we're professing in other corners of our life. And there's been some other much harder moments of separation, particularly around looking at some of the roots of our environmental crisis, which for me, I see as being rooted in white supremacy and colonization and capitalism, systems that our ancestors set up, participated in, benefited from. And that piece has been more challenging for my dad.
Yeah. I imagine it's like his whole life was built in a certain way with certain, the way we think the world is supposed to work and the way we're supposed to operate within it. And sometimes with older people, not always, they're a little more fixed in like how they like to do things. But I imagine that piece, was there just like an avoidance or a shutdown or a wall put up, or was it like, what was his reaction when you would bring that to him? Like some of that inner work or because it seems like you've really sat with and internalized some of these things and come to a place of, my ancestors have been part of the harm, willing to admit that and to hold that without avoidance, but to just own it and to say, and I'm choosing differently. What have you noticed about what it's been like for him?
His inner work, absolutely. And I think when I first started turning towards this work, being the work of dismantling white supremacy and moving towards repair and redistribution, like the first part of that was kind of guilt, shame, self-hatred, wanting to disappear, wishing it were different, and learning to love myself and love the opportunity that it is to be part of a lineage of harm and choose to turn towards healing. That's been the work. And some days I feel connected to, in some ways, the blessing and the privilege that it is to know concretely the harm that I need to be accountable for, to have that clear sense of purpose and direction of, what my life in the context of my lineage is in service to. And definitely in other days, I'm just like, screw it all. I want to hide under my bed and have it all disappear. In that phase that looked like guilt, shame, self-hatred, it was really easy to project that on my dad and hate him and be guilty about him and punish him for the parts of myself that I also wanted to punish. So, it's our journeys are entangled. And one thing he said to me was, Morgan, I've spent my life thinking that the purpose of my work, my career, was to maximize the inheritance of my children. And you're asking me to question all of that. And yes, I am. And that's a big deal, to ask someone to question an assumption that has been guiding their whole life.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask about just the fears around, like, what fears have you faced around becoming public around these types of issues? And what have you faced and overcome and been challenged by?
It's a really good question. And I'll share just the first two things that came to mind. One, I think there's a fear and a story that's built in the culture of wealth in this country and beyond, that is like the scariest possible thing is people knowing that you have money, because then they'll look at you differently, or they'll treat you differently, or they'll only want to be around you for your money, or to take it a step further, they will deceive you, they will steal from you, they will lie to you. And that fear, which absolutely I was raised with, the message of never talk to anyone about how much money you have, still shows up every now and then. And I really appreciate something I read yesterday, which was like, privacy comes really, really easily to wealthy people. Transparency is much harder, and it's a much more effective way to cede power. And so that's been the journey. Is how can I be, so transparent and so visible so that the secrecy and the dominance inherent in it that keeps wealth in the hands of the few can begin to be dissolved. And the hardest part of that is just learning when to say yes and when to say no, because being visible does involve getting asked for money. And the part of me that's been trained to be like the nice white lady that pleases has had to learn how to say no, and know that I can't respond to every single request that comes my way. And I have to practice saying yes to requests, even that make me uncomfortable. So that was the first thing. And then, what was the second thing? I went so into the first one. The second one is just also related to the nice white lady training, is just the fear of making mistakes. Like, I know that by speaking out publicly about wealth, about racial violence, about hierarchy and supremacy, that 100% I'm going to make mistakes in the way that I talk about these things, because of just the profoundly limited and twisted viewpoints I have from my identities as a white, wealthy woman. And I know that we can't let the only public narrative of people in those identities be one about continued accumulation of wealth and power and subscription to consumerism and wealth building. And so if that's not going to be the only narrative for my people, then some of us have to be putting forward a different one. And so just being willing to take risks of getting it wrong in service of creating a different story that other people can join has been terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you had any of those moments of like projection or trolls or just feeling like, oh, you know, something bad happened, or just like all of it?
Not as many as I was afraid of, which I think is a really good lesson. There's with each step of becoming more and more public about this work, there was the idea that somehow I would just be like flooded with haters, and that has not happened. Notice that the mind is more afraid than reality actually is. And what has come through is always like a blessed challenge to engage with. Like, okay, like here's some feedback about something I said, something I did, something I didn't do. And what is there to learn from it? How can I meet this person's anger with curiosity, compassion, empathy? And yeah, I had like a hater on Twitter a few months ago that I ended up direct messaging with, and he ended up being like, I'll be in Oakland for a few months. Maybe we could get lunch. I'd love to talk more.
Oh,
be nice to the haters. This is the message.
Yeah, diffusing the energy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What was it like giving your first big donation?
Yeah. So the first time I moved a significant amount of money was to a youth-led climate justice organization called Sustain Us. And I had been part of and contributing to that organization as an organizer and young person for some years. And so I was invited to like publicly announce the donation at the kind of annual national gathering, and that opportunity to share what we call my money story, where this money comes from and what it's now called to do in response to that history, was an important experience. And out of that moment of sharing, a small committee of indigenous leaders in the organization came together to decide what the money was for. And that process was definitely not perfect. It was messy, and I learned a lot. And I hope that those resources, I gave $50,000, so it was about a seventh of the money that I had at the time. I hope they've gone on to contribute to the development of youth leadership in the climate justice movement. And it's also taught me a lot about not being attached to outcome as a person moving money, and attending to process, and especially the redistribution of power in the process of moving money, and valuing that in such a way that doesn't retain power over an outcome that I might think is desirable or most strategic, or anything else that my mind might want the money to be doing. So.
Mm-hmm. It's a big letting go.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Have you thought about starting your own organization, or mostly just finding the people already doing it?
Yeah, so the ways that I think about moving money through a kind of reparative or redistributive lens is it's about supporting the leadership of Black people, Indigenous people, Brown people, working class people, the movements that I believe are going to win justice, win reparations, win the policies we need to carry us through climate chaos. I believe those are going to be led by the people who've been most impacted by the systems of domination that have created all these issues. And so it's really clear and really important to me that the resources go to support grassroots leadership in that way. So it's very much not about what I think will do best in the various struggles we're facing, but just getting, or one way I sometimes put it is like, let's not ever have the reason that social movements fail be because they didn't have enough resources. Like there is more than enough hoarded wealth in my community to ensure that social movements can win and not have resources stand in the way.
Mm-hmm. If there's anyone out there listening who has been feeling like, oh, I've been wanting to donate money, but then like, sometimes the mind can always talk ourselves out of it. Like, well, but this thing needs to happen, or this thing needs to happen, or I'll, a big one I hear sometimes, like, oh, I'll donate when I reach to this level. And I had a friend once who told me, he was such an inspiring person. He was from India, grew up there, didn't have very much to his name, and he was always giving. Always, like he'd have some rupees and he'd give some to a homeless person or buy someone a chai, and his take on that was, if you wait until a certain time to give, you're probably never going to give. It's like we can start giving now. And from my personal experience of like taking that on and being in that journey, it's like I do notice when inner resistance comes up or the stories come up, like, oh, there's something like so opposite of what we've been ingrained in a capitalist society of like how to work with money. And it's a big thing to overcome just mentally. But my feeling from the other side of when I do take those steps and give or donate is like so much abundance, like such an energy of that generosity. And like I feel like we kind of have to at least try on the feeling of I'm not afraid of not having enough, like in order to be giving. And it's like in a way, it almost puts us in an abundant state of mind. So I'd love to hear just your thoughts on that. And if there is anyone out there feeling like I want to give, but I'm coming up against this block, like any advice you have to help them.
Yeah, you just opened the door to my whole favorite conversation. Yeah. I appreciate how you just framed it around abundance. And a way that I think of that is like, when are we thinking about individual safety, security versus like our collective future? And like, I'm more interested in Indigenous people returning to stewardship of their land, like Black folks having wins against policing and mass incarceration, workers fighting for union rights and universal health care and paid childcare leave. And I'm more interested in those outcomes for everybody than I am in living in a world where I can pay for things and stay safe, but everyone else around me can't. And so it's, yeah, instead of investing in my future, it's investing in our future, which becomes even more easier when I see that I'm not alone in doing that. And not only am I not alone in the process of redistributing wealth, like there's a movement of thousands of particularly young people with inherited wealth who are seeing this isn't mine. Like this was given to me with no work of my own, and it was taken from rights of workers, the lands of indigenous people, the labor of Black folks, and it wants to be returned. And I'm not alone because I'm accompanied by all of those people. And the more I move money, the more I'm tied into webs of relationship and belonging that show me that, yeah, true community and joy and purpose and belonging comes from interdependence and solidarity and mutual aid and, yeah, witnessing and supporting one another, and not because we've hired each other for like professional services, but just because we belong to each other and we feed each other and we care for each other's children and we make things for one another and we, yeah, build networks of reciprocity that are outside of capitalism. And so, yeah, my process of seeing like, okay, I'm not going to rely on any of my inherited wealth to build some version of safety for myself has thrown me into a version of the world that has been stewarded by folks at the margins, whether your friend in India or my Auntie Alicia here in community or neighbors, friends, folks that come from more communally oriented cultures who've been just doing this the whole time, supporting each other without the need to hoard and accumulate huge amounts of resources. And it's freeing. It sets ourselves free to no longer see that we have to make it on our own. Yeah. And I know, like, for folks listening who just heard me say that, it's very possible to be like, that sounds good. But how do I really get there? And it's all just like one little step at a time. And it's, deciding like, this week I'm going to give a few dollars to every houseless person I see on my commute across the city. Or, this week I'm going to check in with 3 friends that I know are struggling to make rent and ask if they'd be open to some support. Or, this week I'm going to pay for the flight home for the holidays for someone that I know otherwise couldn't make it. Or I'm going to make a donation to a really progressive, political city council candidate. It's just those little steps that have us feel more stake, more belonging, more relationship with the people around us. And yeah, those little steps slowly add up to this feeling of I belong and I matter, and so do the people around me.
Heard this concept that happiness really comes when we start trying to make other people happy rather than ourselves.
Yes.
What have you learned about happiness on this journey? Just content.
I'll point in particular to a thread of my work we haven't touched on, which is kind of the deep investigation of where wealth and power in my family has come from. I'm going to get to happiness eventually, but I'm going to start with grief because they're two sides of the same coin. And yeah, when I've looked closely and intimately at the acts of violence in my lineage, whether it's my 5 great-grandfather Silas, after whom my brother is named, who chose to enslave people when he was living in slave states and set people free only when he was living in free states, who was a congressman in the first Congress of this country, or whether it's my ancestor Alexander, who was a colonel in the Second Seminole War, driving the Muskogee and Seminole people from their homelands. When I look closely and truthfully at those acts of immense white supremacist violence, it breaks my heart open. And I think that is core to what we, and by we, I mean white folks, particularly descendants of colonizers and enslavers, particularly those of us who have intergenerational wealth or class privilege, we have to let ourselves be broken open by what our people have done. And yeah, a teacher of mine, Joanna Macy, says a heart that is broken open can hold the whole world. And that's where I've found happiness in a perverse way, is by letting myself be broken open and then walking towards what is mine to do in response to these harms. What does it mean to show up as the latest face of this legacy and walk towards healing? And those moments when I've come into intimate relationship with the descendants of those my ancestors harmed. One example would be survivors of that Seminole War that I mentioned, Muskogee people, a group of friends of mine who've returned to their homelands in Alabama 170 years after that war. When I'm with them, when we're building trust together, when we're laughing and eating and praying, and like, that's true happiness for me. Is like, I have looked like deep into the darkness of my family, my soul, my lineage, and I've said, like, yes, this is mine to hold. And yes, I'm going to do everything I can to respond to it and walk towards healing. And when I have the opportunity to be part of that healing, there's like not been a more profound happiness for me.
Would you suggest people start with ancestry? And it sounds like you've done a lot. And I almost want to say, like, it sounds like the type of thing that would be good to make sure you have support when you start to go into those dark places, because I imagine most of us are going to uncover things we don't want to know.
Yeah, don't go it alone. Whether it's other family members that are ready to do this work with you, or finding groups, resources, workshops where you can be held with others. And the place to start is what's already around in your family. For a lot of people, it's something like Oh, yeah, great aunt Betty. She has a box of family history papers in the closet. I'm going to go visit her and ask to see it. Or, oh, yeah, like second cousin Jeff wrote that leaflet for the family reunion a few years ago. I wonder where that got to. Or, oh, yeah, I started Ancestry.com account for a school project 10 years ago. I'm going to go find the password. It's really remarkable when, we return to the same information that we might have read as a child or a young person, but we return to it with our eyes more open to witnessing where that story might be entangled with some of the foundational harms of this country, whether genocide or slavery or other forms of oppression. Reading the very same information we might have read before can take on new power and be seen in a new light. So definitely recommend beginning with anything that already is, most especially whoever the oldest person is in your family, like great aunt so-and-so or grandparents so-and-so, like go to them now as fast as you can and sit with them, ask if you can record, and just let them tell you everything they know about family history and who your people are. And once you've done that, then there's all sorts of tools and software and libraries and historical societies and places you can go for the information that hasn't already been collected in your family. And I'll also just say on this work that for those of us that are white in this country, it won't take very long doing family history research before we stumble across egregious harm. And whatever that first story that you stumble across is, like, trust that was the one that you stumbled across for a reason, and go deep with it. Learn as much as you can about that person, their story, the context, the history of that state, that time, that place, and most importantly, learn what's happening there and now. The indigenous people of that land, what are they up to? What are they struggling for in 2021? What has happened to Black folks in that city or that state? What forms of organizing are going on in the present moment? And that one story might be enough to dedicate one's life to showing up for. So, let it be enough, whatever it is that you find first.
I'm also curious just what your vision is that you hold for our planet, for our world, for our communities. What kind of world vision do you imagine or hold, or helps you keep going every day?
I use that as an opportunity to read something, if that's okay. This is a letter that I wrote to my descendants, and I think it has a little glimpse of what I hope for the future. So I'm starting in the middle because it's long, but I say, the money that came down through our family, gathered by generations of bankers, lawyers, captains of ships, and industry, has finally been returned to the people and lands from which it was taken. It is my prayer that you are still connected to the Black and Indigenous villages into which it flowed, that you are shaped by their leadership, and that you still find ways to mutually support one another as the world heats and unravels. These villages are refugia of knowledge and wisdom, places where intergenerational trauma was able to be witnessed and healed, where children grew into elders that guided their people onwards. These are your inheritance, your family's legacy.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I think a lot about land. I think a lot about how coming back into right relationship with water, with seeds, with soil, trees, and most importantly, the indigenous people who have known these things for much longer than us is really core to my vision for the future. And it's about returning stewardship of indigenous lands to its people wherever we can. It's about supporting Black folks to have land, knowing that they have poured so much labor and blood into the soil for centuries. And it's also not about having everyone else return to the land while white folks continue extractive capitalism in the city. We also need to remember who we were before all of this. And that can happen in the city too. That's one of the reasons I love where I live. We're in the middle of Oakland, and we're growing food, we're growing herbs, we're remediating the groundwater of heavy metals, we're planting fruit trees and keeping bees, and there's like sideshows and fireworks and gunshots and police sirens all around, but we're still doing our best to remember that we're people upon the earth. So yeah, whenever I need hope for the future, I did this yesterday, actually. What really gives me hope for the future is when a plant has outgrown its pot and I move it into a bigger pot, and it just keeps wanting that every few months or years or so.
Beautiful. Yeah, and anything you want to share, just how people can find you or work with you, or what kind of work you've been doing with people, if there is anyone out interested in staying connected and learning more.
So some years ago, I really heard the invitation from kind of the youth organizers of color and also the Black elders that I was around of like, please go do the work with your own people. And I was like, what? I don't even like white wealthy people. I put in like so much energy to trying to get away from that world. And so as I mentioned, the first step was really learning how to love myself again, and then learning how to love my people again. And that really led me to this work of supporting people with inherited wealth, not just white folks, but anyone who's holding money that came down through lineages that want to be transformed, and being with them, with you, maybe it's you, person listening, through all of the questions that come up from, just like guilt and shame and paralysis, to overwhelm, to not knowing how much is enough, or how to earn money, or where to move money, or where to keep money, how to work with family, how to work with ancestors. And it's been the greatest privilege of mine to learn a few things along the way about accompanying folks through that terrain. And I do that work both one-on-one and in a cohort that we call Ancestors and Money, that's focused on both anti-racist genealogy, so all that research work, and making plans for redistribution and reparative action. And I'd say this work is like half prayers, half spreadsheets. So bringing in a variety of tools to have money be moving while at the same time we're doing our very best to unlearn all the ways in which we've been made tools of domination and control. So, yeah, I would love to hear from anyone who's holding some of those questions or just longings or confusion in situating yourself as someone with more resources than you need, or maybe more resources than you need, trying to figure it out. Would love to hear from you. And yeah, website is a good way to get in touch, morganhcurtis.com. So hope to connect.
Great. And do you have any other closing words for us? Anything you'd love to leave people with? And then I'll just wrap us up with a closing prayer.
Thank you. Oh. What's coming through to say is just like that there gets to be joy in this work. That it can feel so heavy to be walking on the side of benefiting from systems of violence, and to be looking towards our families having had such a large part in setting them up. But really that process of turning towards the truth and finding one another, there's so much joy and play and laughter and just making merry that gets to be part of unlearning how serious and straight-edged capitalism and our Puritan ancestors want us to be. So I'm constantly reminding myself of that and want to invite others into it as well.
Well, just invite us to bring that into our hearts, into our bodies, into our breath. That there can be joy in this work, that there's something so potent about being willing to see, and to look and be in the uncomfortable places, and to have our hearts break, and to realign our values into what we envision, and to know that there's a lot we can do in making change, even if it feels like too much sometimes. Calling in that hope, the growth of all the plants needing new pots. And just feeling, the joy that can come in this redistribution, what could be possible. So just bringing my hands to my heart. Thank you, Morgan, for sharing your wisdom with us and everything that you've embodied over these years. And to everyone listening, thank you for being here and just showing up and being open to learn and be guided. So many blessings. Have a beautiful day. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this episode. If you liked it, share it with a friend or leave us a review on iTunes. You can also follow along on Instagram at Meredith Rom and sign up for email updates at risingwomanleaders.com to be sure to receive all the new and inspiring content. Thanks again for being here. It's an honor to walk this path with you.